Alphabetical.
Am I mic'd? We have an additional guest on the panel this afternoon, and that is Sydney Briggs, who I will introduce in a few minutes. I'm Darren Myers-Kingsley. I'm an independent curator and also was one of the organizers or on the organizing committee for TechFocus. I just want to say a few words. I know everybody's really psyched for this panel. I'm hearing all kinds of discussions at coffee breaks and at lunch. I think between the panelists, we all want to ask each other questions, and I know folks in the audience do as well. I'm going to start by congratulating and thanking Christina Fronert, Agata Jarzik, and Joanna Phillips for conceiving of these 2 days and for all the hard work that they've done for TechFocus and the field of art conservation as a whole. I, for one, cannot wait for tomorrow's School of Seeing. I think it's a groundbreaking achievement and something that we all desperately need. Congratulations also to Jennifer Blessing and Nat Trotman for the Haunted exhibition, and to Carol Stringari and the Guggenheim for hosting the event. As a curator who's worked in both media art exhibition and preservation for 20 years, I'm delighted that the conservation field has come together around the conservation of electronic media, or electronic media actually as an art form in this case. It's been 10 years since tech archaeology that's been mentioned before, but certainly not the beginning of the foray into discussions about media preservation that's been going on for at least 25 or more years. I wanted to remind us also that it's been 11 years since a panel called Buying Time Collecting Video was put on in 1999. Barbara London of MoMA and myself organized that at the Paula Cooper Gallery in 1999, as I just said. This was after working at the Andy Warhol Foundation, where I was in charge of the media works there, and that's when I was thrown into preservation. And I think there are a number of us here who weren't necessarily trained in preservation and really had to learn a lot on the job. So I looked back the other night at the original flyer for that panel to see what questions we asked on that January day. And here's what we asked. What does it mean to preserve a videotape or a video installation? Whose responsibility is it to preserve the work? What's the best format for exhibition, for preservation, for preview? And what should the strategy be when a sale is made to ensure the future life of the work? We were asking the same questions of artists, dealers, collectors, curators, and distributors on the panel as we're asking today. It's also been 11 years since the first steering committee members met at the offices of Electronic Arts Intermix and public television station WNET to form the nonprofit organization known as IMAP. And colleagues from libraries, archives, museums, and independent media organizations, first under Mona Jimenez's leadership and then mine, were there at the beginning. And this convening really comes from the early efforts. I think some people are, certainly John Hanhardt mentioned it, has to be acknowledged from the independent media field. Media Alliance and Experimental TV Center were really there in the beginning. Now there are graduate programs in media preservation and media conservation. I say hallelujah, okay? And it's great to see today colleagues working in organizations and institutions involved in those early pioneering discussions, as well as the newcomers who are here today. So I think we recognize there's still a lot of work to be done together, and that I'm hoping that in these today and tomorrow, the information that we're collecting here continues to be shared, not only in the art world, but also to our sister fields, colleagues, many of whom are, as I say, in the house, okay, because we need to make sure to share. So the question that we're asking, and that we continue to ask, as we're saying today. Who cares? Who cares for video? Whose responsibility is it? So when we ask these questions, we still get different answers. We've heard that today. It depends on who's answering, where they work, how they were trained. Some learn on the job, some learn in one part of a field and then move into another. This field of media preservation is rather fluid, which is both an asset and a limitation. And I think it really depends on the sort of perspective and sort of personality in our field, those who share and those who don't want to share. So when we ask who should care for video, obviously we all should care, but we're asking who in a particular institution. Is it the curator? Is it the conservator? Is it the registrar or the technician? Or perhaps a combination of these? We're also asking who in the field should take the lead in being responsible for owning the expertise to make these decisions. And they're decisions about acquisition, as we've discussed, representation, and conservation. And so are these different questions? Are there different answers? And I think we're also hearing that there may be different questions and answers for new work, for commissioning work, for representing something, and what about historical collections or works? TechFocus is organized by the conservation field, and if you followed the work of the EMG over the years, you can see that these conservators have been making pioneering forays into it and will likely take the lead in electronic media preservation. To me, it makes a lot of sense. Professionals in conservation have built-in standards and practices for approaching a work because conservators are trained in the science of materials. They work from the art object and also in relationship to the history of the work of art, and they follow its condition, or as some people have called it, its iteration over time. But conservators, as we know, are only part of the picture. We have curators, installers, dealers, and the artists themselves, all who play a role. We've heard from our distinguished colleagues, the speakers and moderators today, who come from curatorial, conservation, and technical practice, but I now want to acknowledge the presence of Sydney Briggs on this concluding panel. Sydney brings the registrar's voice into the discussion, and that's one we haven't heard. Sydney's going to speak for a few minutes, followed by Glenn Wharton, who is also from MoMA, and then we'll have a discussion within the panel and then open up to questions from the floor. Let me introduce Sydney. Sydney Briggs is an associate registrar at the Museum of Modern Art. In her role as collection registrar for the Department of Media and Performance Art, she oversees incoming acquisitions, facilitates outgoing loans, and assists with collection installations. She has worked on the installations of several multimedia exhibitions, including Performance 7, Mirage by Joan Jonas, Looking at Music, Side 2, Looking at Music, Multiplex Directions in Art 1970 to Now, Automatic Update. She co-authored an article on collaborative installation efforts at MoMA for the spring 2008 Journal for the American Institute of Conservation, and recently contributed blog entries on installation documentation of Joan Jonas's Mirage for MoMA's Inside Out blog. So I'm going to ask Sydney now to speak to us about her role at MoMA. Thank you.
Hello? Okay. So I was just asked to speak for about 5 minutes just to give the presence of the registrar. We have mentioned that job title a few times today, and I'm very thankful for the opportunity to actually sort of put that voice out on the table, because I think oftentimes we are definitely in the background and people don't understand how important our contribution is to the general collection care of any institution. MoMA has a very specific kind of curatorial division. We divide by mediums. And as a result of that, even though my actual title is Associate Registrar and I work with collections, because we divide according to the medium, I have been had the opportunity to focus primarily on media and performance art. But my actual skill set is as a registrar in working at any kind of collection. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit sick, so. This department was only created in 2007, and it was first established as a Department of Media, and the artwork in the collection was managed primarily by the Department of Film, and that was it held mainly the single channel videos that have now moved into the Department of Media and Performance Art, and all of the large-scale installations were primarily held in the other departments, mostly in the painting and sculpture curatorial department, which is where my position evolved from, because prior to becoming the collection registrar managing media and performance art, I was the painting and sculpture collection registrar. So when we created this new department, we realized that the new curatorial commitment meant that there were going to be an increase of acquisitions and exhibitions and loans, and so it really merited someone's full-time attention. And I was already sort of engaged in dealing with a lot of these works because of the large-scale installations that were coming into our collection. So it was sort of a natural fit for me to move into that. I basically approach my position from an unchanging point of view of the registrar's role as the guardian and caretaker who oversees the intake and handling and movement of art. There is a consistency to that particular role, which is very stable in the face of a medium that is anything but that. It's always variable. But because of the very specific kinds of approaches that you always have to keep sort of consistent in terms of documenting artwork as it comes into your collection, it really gives me a point, a perspective that allows me to then adjust to the needs of the medium. So the variability, there's a range of variability, but it's not so difficult to navigate once I have learned the vocabulary and become accustomed to the material that I'm handling, which includes understanding equipment limitations and format displays. And I lost my track, but that's okay. Essentially, my tracking and collection management goal is to do no harm to the artwork and to make sure that it's always accessible as possible to the curatorial staff, the conservation staff, and any of the staff that works on the exhibition display. So just to give you an example, as a former painting and sculpture registrar, my primary concerns for something like a sculpture would be, I always have to keep into consideration the weight and the mass of a particular piece of sculpture and the material that it's made out of. But with a media work or time-based media work, I might actually have to think about things like the original archive format, exhibition copy generations, program platforms, which all kind of inform what my colleagues will be doing with the work in terms of display and preservation. So it's very important that because I'm usually the front person next to the curator who actually sees and handles these works, that I document structural and condition details at the moment of acquisition and help establish a system of care together with Glenn so that these works become very accessible for future research and display. Because of the basis of this type of medium in technology, one of the things that was established upon the creation of the department was the media working group. So I feel always very fortunate, and I can only say that my success as a registrar is really because of all the other people that I work with. And our media working group consists of curators. There's at least 3 curators on our committee. There are several AV technicians, many of which are in the audience, and they, believe me, are the ones who really kind of make me shine. And we have exhibition designers, Glenn Wharton, who's our media conservator, and now because we have so many works that include digital aspects, we have many IT specialists that work with us, and in fact we have a really fabulous new head of our IT department who really makes me excited because he gets what we're trying to do. So basically, in working in this kind of collaborative environment, it has allowed me to be able to have a certain amount of autonomy and an ability and a confidence in being able to identify formats and perform condition checks together with my colleagues. And I've learned to ask questions and look for information, identifying questions of operating programs or magnetic tape formats and digital files right at the beginning, because really what we're talking about is accessing information from the point of origin. And if we cannot do that at the point of origin, it only makes our job a lot more difficult, because then we have to do all of this digging and figuring out later and backtracking, which sometimes, if it's not well documented, we can't actually figure out what happened. So I definitely feel that for any of you who are registrars out there, that your role is very important, and the more that you educate yourself and become integrated in the discussions about the artwork, the more you're able to really be one of the key players in helping to sort of help create a map by which people can then make really good decisions. So I think that this basically translates into our exhibition. This approach translates into our exhibition displays and the loans of our artworks, that all of the shared knowledge really allows us to address issues of care and how that affects conservation and loan of materials as interrelated issues and not separate concerns, so that we really realize that all of our actions are important contributions to the life of the work.
Well, I'll just be really quick and start by saying thank God for Sydney. What she didn't say is that she really understands media technology, and so she's sort of a foundation for a lot of the work that we do, and tracks the work as it moves around the museum and out to loan up for exhibition, and she sort of keeps us all in line as well. So she plays a really good fundamental role, but I'd also just like to back what she said about the collaboration at MoMA with this media working group. It's been really interesting to meet with curators, AV technicians, registrar, IT personnel, and others, to make decisions about acquisition, exhibitions, loans, reformatting, so conservation interventions. And we really do it as a group, and I can't imagine it any other way, because everyone brings something different to the table. I think I won't say too much more about MoMA, because we've heard a lot about conservation of media in collections all day today. I'm certainly happy to talk to anyone about the projects that I'm doing at MoMA. Instead, I'd like to make a little plug for Inca. Came up this morning, this question of collecting documentation. What do we do with all of this? So Marina Abramovic has authorized 3 slightly different configurations of monitors with her work. I think we all find this, that artists over time will authorize different variations in their work. And what often happens is we collect that information and it goes into our own files at museums at best, if not just in our heads. So there is an organization that I think you should all know about. It's the International Network for the Conservation of Contemporary Art, Inca. It was established in 1999. It was very much a European project, but now there is a North American group, Inca NA, Inca North America. which is just establishing itself. It is now a 501c3, and it is starting to do more programming. But one of the core projects of Inca is an artist archives database. And the idea is that anyone that collects or that's in a position to collect information about an artist's work, contemporary art, not just media, including the artists themselves, can join the organization, make a record in this database, upload a report if they want, or just include a description of an artist's interview they did or some analytical report. Then other members around the world can access this database and see that this institution or this person has this report, has this information. And I think over time this is going to become really critical. As Chrissy mentioned, we're losing a lot of these artists. And if we don't start sharing the information that we're gathering among ourselves internationally, I worry that the information won't be accessible. So Google it, INCCA, and you can learn more about that organization. So with that, I think I'll end my contribution.
Okay, well, the concept and the philosophy of some teamwork and committee structures that we're starting to hear pop up at different institutions in the last few years, I think probably makes some people really comfortable and some people uncomfortable. I mean, speaking, I guess, from a curatorial perspective, if there's teamwork and a whole bunch of colleagues helping to make decisions, it actually affects the curator's role, potentially. So I just wondered if the curators on the panel want to talk about the relationship between curatorial and conservation and the sort of teamwork approach, because I think because we have this rather complicated medium, we actually need the expertise besides the artists, but the technicians and others who are now coming in to help tell the curator some things they need to know, and also the conservation field is also being educated. So does someone want to take that, John?
That sounds like a good question.
Thank you.
Okay. First of all, I just wanted to, I'm picking up on this notion of collaboration. It mentioned institutional collaboration outside of between institutions. And because of the costs and personnel and expertise, I think it's very important that, I would just give as the example the Andy Warhol Film Project, which I began after convincing Andy Warhol to release his films, that we set up a partnership between the Whitney Museum of American Art, where the curatorial expertise and the Catalogue Raisonné project would rest, and the Museum of Modern Art's film archive, which Whitney really couldn't replicate, would take on that project, and then later with the, in Pittsburgh with the Andy Warhol Museum. So I just mentioned that, and I continue to think that regionally and where smaller museums and institutions, this kind of sharing of resources can be important. But in answer specifically to Darren's question, I just want to say that I speak, again, from my own experience when the curator was really the only person who knew about this work and who believed in it, advocated for it, and had to set up the understanding of this medium as an art form, and to help convince the institution to recognize it and to bring its sources of support that it would give to painting and sculpture to the moving image. And I continue to think that that lead has to come from the curatorial end, that we need a diverse curatorial points of view toward that history so that it can be more fully represented. And I think that very much is, and I think it's important that the curators feel the responsibility to work with our registrars and conservators, and also to work to understand the enormous demand that this whole body of work, older and newer work, is putting on these respective programs and departments. And so, again, that's why, museum power flows from the top, and there needs to be that understanding of support for these initiatives that comes from the museum leadership, but the expertise and the knowledge of what this work is and the priorities, I think, has to be shaped and led by the curatorial department, and there again with those who know this medium and this history and can bring that to the conversation. So that's how I think it necessarily has to be to begin and to be structured.
I think you're absolutely right, John, and I think I would add to that for us at the Whitney, the dialogue with Carol Mancuso-Ungaro, the replication committee, Matt Skopek, Carol's conservator, and Richard Blows and Jeff Bergstrom, who are our AV technicians, but they are really experienced in installing installations and video and film works. And in Richard's case, he's been at the Whitney for
Over 20 years.
25 years. And so, in a case like, say, Nan Goldin's Ballad of Sexual Dependency, he was there right at the beginning when Nan showed it in her retrospective that we did at the Whitney in the early 90s. So he is actually and he's set it up many times since. So I think that the dialogue we have, particularly with Richard and Jeff, and then the art handlers, is really key. And actually, because we're unionized, when I arrived, it was very much the case that there was the AV guys over here and the art proprietors over here, and there was very little dialogue. And I said, well, this is crazy. I mean, everybody's installing the show and everyone's working on the same thing. And now everyone works together in very much a team way. And the little things of, well, do you put the foam squares in the ceiling to stop the light, or is that an AV thing? Is it an art? And now that doesn't even enter into it, because there's so much synergy between the group, and everyone is now so used to film and video installation and slide pieces being part of shows, part of biennials, part of everything. They do it without thinking, and so I think that the actual dialogue with the preparators and the AV technicians is for us key, and the AV technicians are also the ones that draw up with us the installation manuals for each piece, and then I will do the video interviews. So it's very collaborative, and also with the registrars, I have to say too. Very important.
Well, I just would like to say that certainly the collaboration with the Conservation Department, having Joanna here, it's like this fantastic, we're blessed with this fantastic resource. I couldn't be happier. And also Jeffrey Warda, who is Associate Conservator of Paper, who's here and works with the photography collection. I feel like, especially with acquisitions of very recent work, and work that we haven't yet shown, but I think that my ignorance is profound, basically, because I'm coming from a background in the study of performance art and performance documentation and conceptual art, where the work is about the idea. It may be immaterial. The format in which it's realized is very variable. It's also the case with photography. Photography as a medium was often something that wasn't necessarily intended to be displayed on a wall, and so it's by nature conceptual media, and it's very important for me to be reminded of the materiality of it. And I think also the artists that we're working with, because very often my dialogue is with an artist who is also not necessarily engaged with thinking about the long term and how to preserve something for the future. And I think that is an awareness that I have developed through my interactions with you and with Jeffrey, and that I'm now constantly thinking about 100 years, 200, 500 years, and that it's not just what we put on the wall now, today. So.
I'd like to contribute a little anecdote. Since you're saying, dealing or cooperating with conservation is actually an eye-opener, and thinking about the longevity of installations that are based on obsolete technology. The Tacita Dean film installation that you might have seen over the lunch break upstairs, that the Conservation Department provided the exhibition copies for, is actually the last piece. The 16mm prints for were produced here in New York before the last facility that did 16mm reproduction in New York closed down. So it was actually the last artwork that was reproduced there before the last possibility of printing 16mm here in New York died. And I guess, and we talked a little bit about the variability and the change in between formats, and can you convert video to film and vice versa. I am too very much in favor of an active and stimulated collaboration between all disciplines that are part of the decision making and caretaking and displaying artworks. I do think that it absolutely needs the conservator's role, the conservator's historical awareness, I think, because oftentimes what I see, if there's no conservator involved, is an intense collaboration between the curator and the artist going on, and of course the artist is the person to authorize changes to the piece, but he is also the person with the changing opinions and the loss of memory, as I explained previously, and the person who might update his piece due to his very personal intentions behind it. And I think it requires some kind of objective or neutral authority there who tries to put this piece into a context, into an historical context, basically, and tries to contribute to an historically informed decision making. And for all the other genres in art, more traditional art, paintings, objects, and so forth, that is the conservator. We are having the discussions about how much patina we want on that piece, how that piece is, how much of an historical trace you see on there. And therefore, being a conservator, I feel that responsibility too for caring for the media artworks. Yeah.
I was going to advocate that it's true having a conservator there with a sort of a neutral perspective is important. I find myself, we have an excellent curatorial conservation team at San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, but there's not a specific conservator working just with media. So what I will find is that I'll be in a situation where, at the end of the day, the show needs to be up. So is there a corner that needs to be cut, or it's not even really, that's not the right analogy, but just the decisions that I'm going to make are driven more by what do I need to do to have this thing happen. And if there's, certainly if there's a historical object, then that's part of that conversation, and that's ideally part of the conversation beforehand. But it definitely helps to then have like another party that's represented to help make, open up that conversation for that. But just in terms of the power, at SF MoMA, the directions that we take in terms of how we're caring for the work or those perspectives definitely come from the curatorial side, and we look to them to help understand, well, what is the direction that you'd like to see this go? And that's as much because of, I think, differences in curatorial style. Some who I'm honoring more the artist and their intention and what we need to do, or I'm honoring the historical artifact of what that is. And those are very much conversations that go on and happen. And then so from a technician standpoint or registration, conservation, how can we then support that? And then that's part of that conversation.
So the decisions then are being made, conservation decisions are being made by curatorial or being made by others outside of your institution?
I would say that for example, Rudolf Frieling or Henry Orbach have specific, when they've collected work, they're collecting it with a particular reason in mind. And then we would definitely engage with them in conversation. What is it about this? And that will help in terms of the installation. They have a vision about how they'd like to see this work displayed, particularly if we're having to purchase new equipment or if there's historic equipment for it. What is it that's their vision of it in the gallery? And then it in the collection. What is it about that piece that you're wanting to maintain? And then that informs my role in that is well, this is technology we have available, or if you're wanting something different than that, has an implication this way, or we could go that way, and helps guide it. I guess it more guides that. So they're setting a direction and a perspective that then we're helping to reinforce. So, when it comes to then a specific thing, there's I could have an opinion about a technology or how if we went this way, then this we'll have then more shared obsolete work as opposed to having a bazillion different pieces that you're trying to manage.
I think we would all agree, though, that there are certainly not enough conservators who are trained in media preservation, right? Glenn?
Yeah, I was just thinking, as Steve and Joanna were talking, that maybe it's not necessarily that you need a conservator there, because there are only a few positions right now for media conservators in museums. Not that they're not needed, but they're not there. So maybe it's a conservation way of thinking that we need to have in the museum, whether it's the registrar, the installer, the technician, the curator, the artist that's making the decision. So I'd like to suggest that we're all working in this area where these traditional professional boundaries are becoming less and less distinct. And I'm not saying that we should all, just become one profession. There are many roles to play, but if there is no conservator, maybe a conservation way of thinking about the history of the piece, the integrity of the piece, and the future of the piece as well, needs to be at the table along with all these other perspectives.
1 second, just to follow that up, because I'd like to bring Heather into the conversation. I mean, Heather is an example of a person who is doing media preservation who is not trained as a conservator and yet is brought into these discussions. Maybe you can talk about how do you work with artists or stay up on the newest technology and the sort of standards being set in this field.
Well, I'm primarily an online editor and a colorist. I'm the final stage of post-production for shows going to broadcast and going to major film festivals. So usually what happens is an artist or an independent producer will come to me to finish their piece in my suite, which is perfectly calibrated with surround sound, with the proper waveform monitors and vector scopes, and with a very color critical monitor. And they'll come in and they'll sit with me and they'll say, I want my piece to look like an 18th century painting, or they want to create a mood by manipulating the color in their piece. So when I'm starting with a new work, that's all fine and good. But when I'm working on a preservation or a restoration project for a museum, if you let just the artist come in, I can guarantee you that they're going to want to make changes without a conservator there kind of reining them back. When we worked on the Eternal Frame, Pip Lawrenson of the Tate came in, and she helped guide the process, because the artist's inclination is, well, I made that 15 years ago, 20 years ago, can't you make it look better now? And it's, well, yeah, but, you don't want to take away from the integrity of the piece.
One of the questions that keeps coming back, I think, is when do we set the work as being the, let's call it original, or its first iteration, or are we trying to hold it to that, and that issue of restoration versus recreation versus change over time? We haven't really talked about that philosophically or ethically yet, and maybe someone wants to tackle that a little bit.
Well, I think that, from the early 90s when galleries started editioning moving image installations and selling them to museums, a situation was created whereby several of us own the same piece, and yet we don't always talk to each other as much as we could do. And I think Media Matters is fantastic, but the reality is that it's like a closed shop between three museums who talk to each other, but all the rest of us, like the Whitney, the Guggenheim, the Walker Art Institute of Chicago, the Pompidou Center, the Reina Sofia, museums that have a very strong commitment to film and video in the collections that they have. I think that we all need to be talking, the Stedelijk, we all need to be talking to each other. I mean, I'd love to see a conference that was almost like a closed situation to start with, where all the museums got together just to, who worked with film and video and media work, and just got together to discuss, curators, registrars, conservators, what their collections are, and AV technicians and people who install the works. It would be a fantastic group to get together. And I think that perhaps we need to be more proactive as well. I'm trying a little bit, but to actually discuss. I made a list of all the other museums who own the same work that I do in an edition, so that we can try and start talking about, that same work, because that's one way in which we can try and get to the question of where do you stop, what are the parameters? Because if you're restoring a work or making all these provisions for it, and then the same work is being given different parameters in two different museums, that makes no sense.
I think that one of the things that I've been thinking about as everyone is talking about the absent artist, and I think there should be an artist here, or there should be artists involved in this discussion, because we're all kind of channeling maybe what the artist might say. And I'm struck by there's a variability in what we each hear being said. And I have the feeling with Marina, for example, that people heard things, and it may not have been, it could very well be that she said different things or agreed to different things, but it could also be that different things were heard by the person. And so how you kind of interpret or come up with a way, short of recording every interaction you ever have with an artist, how do you come up with data that's not, transformed by the person who's witnessing it? And I think, that's...
One way of doing that is to actually trace back to, say, the curator who commissioned a piece. Like, I toured that show to 5 venues in Europe, and all those 5 venues used different monitors. So, there wasn't just, there were our basic domestic monitors, but then, when it went to Europe and Australia, they used all sorts of different monitors. So that piece has been shown, at least 8 different times with different kinds of monitors, and that's probably fine. But, to actually go to the curator, like with Paul Sharretts, haven't asked you this yet, John, but, I want to talk to John about, your relationship with Sharretts and what you did, because, I'm researching a retrospective and looking back at things you've done, and I'm, beginning to work on that. So, I think the curator who makes an initial commission or has the initial contact with the artist can often be very useful, because they're making lots of nitty-gritty decisions about certain pieces, and people can go back to that curator.
I was going to just say that we're talking as, well, the rest of you, not myself, because I'm unaffiliated, but from the institutional perspective. And I'm also thinking about young curators and other people out there, and we say we need to develop connoisseurship and we need more experts who truly know the history of the medium. I know that Sydney had to sort of teach herself and learn on the job, that if something came into the MoMA collection from supposedly 1970 or 1990, that it wouldn't have been on, a digital file or whatever. Your formats, and how do we begin to share not only this curatorial knowledge of the history of a single piece, but also what we're trying to do here too, teach some of the technical.
I can answer a little bit of that because, that's the whole point of our media working group. I'm trained as an art historian, that's my background, so I didn't come completely blind and unknowing of this, of art. I'd studied contemporary art, so I had an idea about how artists were working but of course, getting into the nitty-gritty of the technical aspect of it, that is something that I wasn't trained in. So of course I go to my audiovisual technicians and they sit with me when we view incoming acquisitions, and I ask them questions like, well, what is that? What is black magic? What is that? I don't understand. Why can't we open this file? Oh, well, that's a file, the program that we don't carry here in the museum, but it's an open source type of program that you can use for production. Just to get an answer like that, because I just go and ask them, and those are the people who I feel should know, and I'm taking advantage of them, and I'm very happy that I have that opportunity. And I think in most cases, that's how all of us learn everything, is that we talk with each other and we exploit our relationships with our colleagues in our inside institutions and just in social situations in general. I know a ton of conservators, and so I spend a lot of time talking to them about conservation. So I learn a lot about conservation. And I just want to backtrack to what Chrissy was saying about having the iteration of the Marina Abramovic in 8 different locations. Well, yeah, you're going to be the primary person that's going to have a lot of that information, but if the work originated with you and you had a registrar who was tracking it for you, they're going to actually, in each location, well, I don't know if everyone would do that, but I would do that, is basically ask each institution, how did you install it? What is the equipment that you use? What is any kind of variation that happened? And give that information back to you so that you have that in your file, or we have it in our internally in the museum's file, so that whoever wants to come back to this again can in fact already have that information readily at hand. Then the last point I wanted to make, which was kind of in touching on Joanna, which was saying that you wanted to always have a conservation mindset in dealing with artwork as you look towards reinstalling it for the future. Those of us that spend a lot of time with this work, we do think about that on a regular basis. But I do agree that there are sometimes curators, registrars, everyone who doesn't have this kind of constant relationship with this work, and so they approach it in a way that I would say is more about the fact that it's very contemporary. It's something that's very much in all of our immediate generational experience. And so we don't really feel the same way about a video that we would feel about a 19th century painting or a crucifixion. We just don't, we haven't historicized it in that kind of way. So I think that we need to keep that in our minds as well too, that is something that those of us that don't spend all of our time really in this, they're not looking at it that way, and that should be our goal, is to help them realize it has the same importance.
There's one thing I just like to add, and because I'm deeply involved with this issue of artist archives. This is the materials from their studios, their writings, their papers, their correspondence, the ephemera that's been generated and reflects and offers an access to work across their career. And this is one of the things when I left the Guggenheim, because it was not an archival institution in that way, and the Smithsonian is, and it's made a major commitment with the Nam June Paik archive, and I'm looking to attract other artists' archives there, because looking at the writings, looking at the materials, and this has become a challenge for the archivists themselves, the paper archivists. There's different kinds of materials that they're not customarily working with. The registrar is dealing with a range of objects and materials from the artist's studio that are now being organized and put into play to give insight into the creative process of this artist, how he went from idea through materials to the artwork. So I just want to make a case for that being an additional aspect of insight into what we're talking about in terms of the artwork, its origin, its original nature. Much of this is visible in close readings of artist archives.
So that's really important, because one thing I just want to add was that when Cleaning the Mirror, we were a non-collecting institution, so there was no registrars, no A, and B, it didn't belong to anyone, because we just commissioned it and it was only bought much later. So I think that also becomes important when you think about, someone actually contacted me about and he said, I'm in the Marina Abramovich files at the Museum of Modern Art. I've got two drawers full of this stuff, and thank you, and was asking me questions. So sometimes, these kind of works get produced in situations that are very different to museums and only end up in museums a long time after the fact.
I think, may I just comment briefly on what you said? What you just said about the Marina Abramovich piece, and that you didn't own the piece when it was, it was not part of your collection, right?
We didn't have a collection.
You didn't have a collection then, yeah. That actually, that is actually important for the question that Dara asked earlier. When is an artwork complete, and a media artwork or an installation in particular that is so variable. And I think to most installations and media artworks, there's a kind of infancy period to them where because you do not see or perceive the work unless it is installed, the artist often sees it for the very first time, when it's being shown on gallery grounds or in a museum. And that is certainly the case, for example, with the Tacita Dean piece upstairs. I've been tracking back the 7 previous installations of it, and it has changed a lot every time, and with every manifestation of the piece, the artist decided, next time we're not going to do it like that anymore. We are going to not have it spread out over 3 rooms. It's just going to be 1 room from now on. This with the 2 speakers was not good. It's just too noisy. We want 1 speaker instead. So there's a kind of evolutionary process to it. And of course, conservators, even if the piece is commissioned and therefore in a collection from its very early stage on, conservators and caretakers have to step back and allow this piece to mature before it's actually developing an identity. And I don't want to create the impression that I'm trying to be as purist as possible. Now you've shown it like this the first time, it has to stay like this. That's not the case at all, So in particular with pieces like the early Marina Abramovich that wasn't collected yet, it was probably more variable, and also in her mind, because she was trying out things and she wanted to see it in different ways. So infancy of the artwork, another really interesting topic, maybe for another conference.
All right, well, I have to be the bad girl and call it a day. We're going to reconvene tomorrow. A little reminder, at 9 o'clock we start. No coffee. So come all caffeined up. 9 o'clock, we'll have the doors open as of 8:30. And I want to thank all the speakers and moderators for today, and everyone, the theater staff, and I look forward to continuing the dialogue tomorrow. Thank you. you.